Sometimes animals really get under our skin. After finding a newborn after a vehicle accident, this wolf takes her into the woods where the unimaginable occurs. Welcome to USA Stories channel. Do not forget to subscribe and activate the bell button to receive all new updates. Now let's go to the story. The sound of a car tumbling down the edge of an embankment had silenced the birds and the noises of the woods, creating an unearthly calm. The woman behind the wheel lost control of the automobile after one of the tires blew. It left the road and began to roll down the little slope until it struck the gravel. The woman was hurled from the vehicle. A baby was wailing, glass was cracking, and there was the sound of metal breaking and bending. At last, the vehicle stopped, and silence descended. The infant had even stopped wailing, as if she was shocked. The woman was unconscious, but she did groan. She couldn't concentrate long enough to wake herself awake, even though she was in agony and frightened for her child. The air was heavy with smoke. The infant was still buckled up in the car seat, even though it was partially removed from the vehicle. It was lying face down. Then, all of a sudden, an odd event occurred. A wolf emerged from the forest. It rose to its feet, inhaled deeply, and approached the mother. The wolf realized her health was failing and it smelled blood. Then it went to the vehicle seat next to the automobile, the smoke rising from the hood. The infant started to wail again as the wolf grabbed the car seat and pulled at it. The mother woke up from her sleep to see the large wolf standing close to her kid as it investigated the little one. Then she saw the wolf, with its jaws bared menacingly. She wanted to scream, but once again the woman passed out. She was blind to the fact that the wolf was intently chewing on the straps holding the infant in place. After the infant was free, the wolf dragged her into the woods and carefully lifted her by her clothes. In the meanwhile, the woman possessed a smartphone app that, in the case of a vehicle accident, could immediately notify emergency personnel and the police. As help approached, it happened just in time to see the automobile begin to catch fire and burn in the forested area. They sent out a search and rescue specialist, Nolan Stevens, at the same time. He was the first to arrive and got right to work. Nolan dashed to the car and attempted to look inside for survivors, but he was unable to get too near due to the tremendous heat. He was a veteran and did not give up lightly. Therefore, it's likely that he tried to pry the door open. Luckily, he didn't need to do that since he saw the woman on the slope where she had been flung from the car right then. He tried to move her, but she was hardly breathing. After such a horrific tragedy, she may undoubtedly suffer a neck injury. One incorrect move could render her permanently paralyzed. If her respiration stopped, he knew better than to take any chances. He refused to intervene. He let out a breath he hadn't even realized he'd been holding until the ambulance pulled up. After determining that her brain injury was critical and that her injuries were severe, the EMTs moved quickly but cautiously to get her into the ambulance. She began to wake up halfway to the hospital. Though she was having trouble speaking, she immediately called out for Anna. She persisted in begging for this unidentified individual despite a paramedic's best efforts to calm her down. They initially assumed she was merely rambling, but then they heard some words that instantly chilled them to the bone. The mother repeated herself, repeating, "My baby." She then inquired as to her child's well-being. It was the first time that anybody had ever recognized that other individual had been involved in the collision. The mother had to rush to the hospital, so they were unable to return, but they did radio the information to the other first responders. Someone needed to go look for the infant over there. Nolan was the most experienced and closest of them all. Turning around, he hurried back to the spot, cursing himself for not searching the area when the cops came. The fire in the automobile was out, but it still didn't seem good. If the infant had been inside when it started to fire, his initial assumption was that she would not have lived. He prayed that by some miracle the infant had survived. Nolan focused his gaze on the automobile and saw a drag line trailing out in the opposite direction. He was determined to follow these signs, and after a while he found the car seat tucked away behind some shrubs. It was a huge relief. The infant may have been seriously injured by smoke and fumes if the car seat had been placed too close to the automobile, but in some manner, it had been dragged far enough away from the flaming automobile to give young Anna a chance. He turned the car seat over, ready to pick up the infant and carry her home. He was shocked to see that the infant wasn't in the seat. Moreover, the car seat's safety belt had been clumsily snipped with sharp edges. It was a perplexing sight. The infant had disappeared. Nolan was investigating when he noticed something horrifying: enormous paw tracks that he knew belonged to a very huge wolf. Was it too late to save the infant if a wolf had stolen her? He made the decision to try and find out by following the tracks. Even if it was too late, at least he could provide some closure for the family. Nevertheless, he made the choice to think positively and persuade himself that the infant was secure outside. The converse was simply too unbelievable to contemplate. Nolan quickly sent his squad, telling them of his objective to save the infant. Within minutes after finding the car seat, he was ready for the hike thanks to his bag full of necessary hiking supplies. The squad would assemble around him as quickly as possible since time was of the importance. For as long as it was daylight, Nolan followed the wolf's trails with diligence. However, the approaching darkness presented a challenge to him. He had to call off his hunt as darkness fell. He carried a flashlight, but it may be the difference between finding the baby and losing her for good. The idea of going back to his cozy, warm bed while a baby was out in the cold was too much for Nolan to handle. Not wasting time going home and then coming back was his goal. Rather, he would remain there until the first rays of dawn. He set up a temporary camp after telling his group of his plans. He was going to locate the baby as soon as possible if she was anywhere near. He had trouble sleeping and was afraid that something was happening to young Anna every time he heard a wolf cry. He was worried for the infant because it was cold outside. She'd recently been in a horrible vehicle accident on top of the fact that she was probably with a wolf. She may have required medical attention for severe wounds. Everything about the scenario was horrible. The one bright spot in this dire scenario was that when Anna's mother arrived at the hospital, it was discovered that her neck and spine were unharmed. Quite amazing given how the mother had been flung from the car. They did find out, though, that she had serious head injuries. Her physicians were forced to make the difficult decision to place her in an induced coma so that she could recover. Though the state of her health worried the physicians greatly, Nolan felt a tiny bit relieved that they didn't have to inform a mother that her infant was lost in the woods and that the only clue they had to find her was wolf footprints. The rest of the family wasn't as fortunate, but for the time being, the mother was blissfully unaware of the danger her infant was in. All Anna's father wanted to do was go out and locate her. They reassured him that the matter was being handled by more seasoned experts. Being strong for his wife and being by her side was the best he could do. It was challenging. Throughout his time in the Army and in search and rescue, Nolan had participated in several rescue operations, but this was the most anxious he had ever felt. Most of the time, he had looked for adults, or at least teens, who may be able to fend for themselves until they were found. But in this instance, they were dealing with a defenseless infant who wasn't quite a year old and didn't know how to take care of herself. She was totally dependent on them to save her, and they had to act quickly. He was going to use all effort possible to see that through. He left again as soon as there was enough light to see. It was a frigid day, but Nolan didn't want to consider the implications for the unborn child. He knew the wolf family in the region had formerly utilized a number of the dens he passed along the way because of the wolf footprints. Many of the recordings were overlaid on one another. Nolan needed to use caution. Though he was only one man, his experience was immense. Should a pack of wolves attack him, Nolan was aware that his chances of success were slim. Furthermore, the wolves would probably respond violently if they felt that their young were under danger. But his personal safety was not on his mind. He had to locate the youngster. His hands shaking and his pulse pounding, he carefully shone his flashlight inside the den, fearing for his life as well as the wolves' possible discovery. He was afraid of what would happen if he found the kid, even as he wanted to discover it. What kind of physical state would she be in? Would their hearts be forever scarred by this accident? It was a possibility he could not deny, but he had to force himself to go past his emotions and continue. The first den was left unattended. The entrance was even covered with spider webs. It had not been used by the wolves recently. With every den in the vicinity, he failed. All it had done was steal part of his time. time he could have spent looking for her. An already terrible day was made worse by the fact that he had to pass their dens. It was difficult to determine which of the paw prints belonged to the wolf he had been pursuing since they overlapped. There was no way he could lose the tracks now, or there would be no chance left for them. He returned to the spot where he'd last seen the footprints and proceeded further with caution, keeping close to the wolf he was pursuing. Eventually, he emerged from the other side, still aware of the paw prints to avoid. He might follow along. The land began to seem a lot more familiar as he went forward. Even though he had come from the other side of the forest, he had undoubtedly been in this location before. He had even rescued a group of adventure-seeking teens in these woods previously. You might easily get lost in the woods if you weren't cautious, even if it appeared like a fairly straightforward trek. Officials from the park erected a few huts with rudimentary amenities all over the region for precisely that reason. In this manner, when camping got too chilly, folks could simply utilize the cabin as a comfortable place to stay, or stock up if they were running low on supplies. But that was of no use to Nolan now. Cabins of safety are not precisely known to wolves. Or are they? Not that there were usually many people in those cabins, but the tracks weren't directing Nolan in their direction. They brought him up into the mountains instead. When he began to comprehend where the wolf was heading, he was taken aback. Following the trails, he found himself in a secluded cottage in the woods, which was often inhabited by park guards and sometimes biologists. Given that wolves are naturally timid, why is this one approaching humans directly? It was so strange. The worst aspect was that months had passed since the cottage had been abandoned. The wolf would be disappointed if he had been expecting to see someone there. Nolan moved a great deal more quickly since he knew exactly where he was heading. After the vehicle accident, the wolf had located the infant and taken her into the woods. However, the unimaginable was about to occur. When he arrived at the clearing where the cabin was constructed, he discovered something on the porch that would permanently alter his perspective. Instead of the wolf that he thought had injured the infant, he saw a wolf lounging in the sun, and a small infant was nestled in its side. Nolan was concerned since she wasn't sobbing. He needed to get her away from the wolf who was treating her like a puppy before he could rush to seek her medical attention. However, an odd thing happened next. The wolf sprang to its feet the once it noticed Nolan. Nolan pulled out his flare gun to protect himself in case there was any hostility, but that wouldn't be needed. After giving the infant a quick glance, the wolf left the porch and turned to depart. The way the wolf behaved indicated that it was only trying to get assistance for the infant and get her back with her own kind. The realization that the wolf had never posed a threat was startling in light of everything that had transpired. Actually, it kept the infant alive. It tried to transfer the infant to other humans who could take care of her after taking her from the burning automobile, perhaps thinking the mother wouldn't make it. At the edge of the woodland, the wolf stopped and stared at the infant for a short while before turning and walking away. Nolan hurried over to the infant. The infant remained cozy even though the day was really chilly. She'd not frozen thanks to the wolf's comforting embrace. It was astounding how much empathy this wolf had displayed. Still, that did not imply the infant was secure. She was bruised from the automobile accident, but she had no bite marks or other signs that the wolf had been hard with her. What if she was hurt inside? They needed to get her over to the hospital right away. The infant stopped breathing, which was a horrible event that occurred immediately after Nolan had taken her up. She needed aid urgently. There was no time to trek out of the woods with her. Nolan started mouth-to-mouth resuscitation right away. Her pulse was still there, but it was quite weak, so Nolan was relieved that compressions weren't needed. He was worried he might hurt her more by mistake because of his stature. The toddler took a few breaths and began breathing normally again. There were no shortcuts used by Nolan. After making a distress call, he picked up the infant and went to a nearby clearing. After a short amount of walking, he turned to face the wolf who was after them. The animal nevertheless appeared to be concerned about the welfare of the unborn child. It should have been unpleasant to be the target of a wolf stalker. But it was consoling to Nolan in an odd way. It gave him the impression that he wasn't the only one shouldering this heavy burden of raising this small child. Despite having been in numerous stressful circumstances and saving many lives throughout his tenure in the Army, Nolan had never felt more terrified than he did as he looked down at the little, vulnerable young girl in his arms. When the helicopter carrying paramedics finally came, it was a huge relief. Nolan might give the baby to them, and they would take her to the hospital, where her worried relatives would be waiting for her. The infant suffered a few minor wounds, but they were all quickly treated. However, that might not have happened if a man and a wolf hadn't intervened. When the mother's artificial coma was lifted a few days later, she saw her husband's face, who was holding Anna, right away. The infant was contentedly sucking on her hands, as flawless as a newborn could be. The mother was going to fully recover and the baby was safe. A later request was made to personally thank Nolan in person. The sight of the smiling, content infant nestled in her mother's arms drove the large guy to tears. A few months later, the couple expressed their gratitude in a different way. After leading the family to the ancient cabin, Nolan discovered the infant and the wolf. The family was curious as to where it all happened. Nolan's eyes were drawn to a movement as they were glancing about. There at the edge of the woodland stood the wolf once more. It studied all of them, even the infant, for a few seconds, and then, as swiftly as the wolf materialized, it disappeared back into the forest. When it realized that the child it had rescued was alive and well, her family decided to adore Nolan and the wolf for eternity. Please remember to subscribe to our channel, give us a thumbs up, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our videos. If you enjoyed the tale, the next video that plays on your screen will probably move you too.